We start with a few words on your background, your history.
Sure, yeah. So for those who don't know me, Bradford Cross is my name. My background is in finance and applied AI. So I was a multi-major in undergrad and in grad school. And I've done initially hedge funds, building fully automated machine learning powered trading strategies in the early 2000s. I was at Google a couple years working on big distributed systems. And then I've built AI startups for about 10 years now, and co-founded Data Collective as well back in 2011.
Great. So actually maybe a word on Data Collective. What is it? How large is it? We had the pleasure of having Matt Turck a long time ago, but it's been a while.
Yeah, so Data Collective started a long time ago, and it's kind of like this, except much more informal. We had something called Data Drinking Group in San Francisco. So it was similar to this, sans any talks. It was only the alcohol part. But discussion of data was also highly encouraged, of course. And it was really a terrific group of folks. Many of the folks in there have now gone on to be extremely successful founder CEOs, people that are running important research groups at top tech companies, venture capitalists, et cetera. And Data Collective was actually a venture firm that kind of fell out of this data drinking group that we created in San Francisco. I can't even remember how long ago now, but over 10 years ago. And so we started in 2011. I think we were probably the first very boutique data and AI-focused venture capital fund. And we ended up with very lucky timing. So we've become a kind of a marquee fund. So we see quite a lot in terms of the deal flow for people that are working on data ventures, AI ventures, space tech, ag tech, biotech. We really see quite a lot of the deep tech deal flow in the venture community worldwide now. So it's been great. We've expanded from just pure kind of more data AI oriented stuff out into deep tech applied, much more broadly. So, yeah.
Great. And maybe for context, a quick word on Merlon.
And so I personally nowadays, I focus on what I call vertical AI, or AI up at the application level of the stack. That's particularly targeted towards an industry vertical. And the current company that I run, which we started last year, is called Merlon Intelligence. Merlon applies AI to the anti-money laundering area in banks. Yeah, so it turns out compliance in banks is just a complete disaster. They're spending something like $20 to $100 billion a year on this. The big ones like JP Morgan Chase, Citi, et cetera, have 10,000 plus analysts working on this every year. They're spending $2 to $4 billion a year on compliance. And really, it's just horrible, archaic risk ranking systems, effectively, that are spitting out these false positive alerts, and you have an army of people processing those alerts. I think it's really a bread and butter problem for AI within industry verticals. You see a lot of these types of problems that are looming out there, where you have an industry, it's spending billions of dollars on some antiquated process, which can very clearly be optimized in a number of ways, but it's complicated because there's many people involved. They're using applications, doing some task, and just naively coming in and saying, oh, we can obviously optimize this with machine learning is not a full answer to the solution. So that tends to be the kind of thing I focus on. And for me, when I was looking across a lot of different things in financial services last year, this compliance problem really jumped out.
Great. So you are truly one of my favorite writers when it comes to AI. I really like especially a couple of blog posts that you wrote this year, and you had one towards the beginning of the year that I thought was really interesting, where you had predictions for 2017. So I'd love to talk about some of those, and I guess maybe as we get towards the end of 2017, whether you still feel the same or more.
Right.
Could be worse. Could be a 2018, early 2018. So one of the first predictions was bots go bust.
Yeah, I definitely feel like that one's happening from a lot of customers that I see in different industries. They've tried a lot of POCs around bots in the past year or 2 years. Mostly haven't really panned out. So I think that's right. I think a lot of people got very, very overexcited about chat bots and all kinds of different bots, and ultimately it was a mania. You know, it was one of these things where the tech becomes the watchword as opposed to the customer need or the business need, right? It's like, what is the business need for bots, right? Bots is like it's a thing. It's like VR, right? Whenever I see one of these things, they tend to not work, right? These kind of tech-oriented trends. They don't start from the need. They start from the hammer looking for the nail. And I think that was the case with bots. Absolutely. You know, the notion that there's some kind of, you know, business process optimization or automation that will happen that's useful is of course true and has already been happening for 20, 30 years. You know, interacting with your bank via SMS has again already been happening for quite some time. So I think absolutely those types of interfaces will continue to evolve, but the idea that everything was going to move to the you know, conversational interface and everybody look at the chat apps in China and now it's all going to happen that way in the US and Europe, all of that stuff has kind of fizzled out, I feel like. Mm-hmm. So I think that was kind of like...
those apps and bots could work in China and not here? Is that just cultural?
No, I think it's just like people are missing how it's working, right? So in China, first of all, is a very particular type of economy, obviously, but also the way that people interact on these chat platforms, let's call them, is very natural and organic for them, whether they're ordering a pizza or doing whatever. Whereas when you look at the attempts to do these types of interfaces in the West, I feel like they're really completely missing any kind of ways that human beings like to interact with one another. And it reminds me quite a lot of what happened with the personalization wars in my last startup, which we ended up selling to LinkedIn. You know, there was a huge discussion around where were people going to get their content and, you know, what was going to happen to all the news platforms and so on. And obviously now we all know the answer is like social won. They all use only social. And so now we're all worried about the Russians hacking the election and everything because basically everyone gets their content from Facebook, and the Facebook newsfeed ranking algorithm controls the vast majority of like what people think in the US, which is crazy. But that's the world that we live in. And I think the same thing is going to happen when it comes to all of the bots, the series, etc. That human beings want to interact with other human beings, and we meet a lot of our emotional needs and different types of needs through these interactions. And I think Silicon Valley in particular is completely detached right now from the consumer world. So I don't expect to see very many consumer success stories coming from Silicon Valley right now until we have a major correction. Because people are, you know, trying to figure out how do I have a car that has exactly the kind of sushi I want, you know, 30 seconds from my house so that I can like tap something on my iPhone and have it show up. It's like, dude, that's a very small set of people who have that problem, right? It's like, I'm sure it's super cool for you and like 4 of your homies, but for the rest of the world, it's not a real problem. And I think that we're getting caught into this with the bots and with the chat and so on. Like, people don't want to interact with machines in this way. They want to interact with other people. And although there may be a lot of utility in some of these systems, what will happen is they end up getting folded into systems that really meet the more basic human needs. So in the same way that, you know, companies like Prismatic or other kind of more hardcore technology companies were bought and incorporated into Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc., I think we'll see that also with bots.
Great. Thank you. Another one of your predictions was deep learning goes commodity. So deep learning being the key part of this whole AI revival?
Yeah, I think that one has definitely been happening, and it's very good, right? I mean, deep learning for a long time was viewed as sort of crackpot stuff. Neural nets in general are viewed as crackpot stuff for a long time. But there was quite a lot of good work going on, and now people realize that, and the academic community has adjusted very rapidly. It's pretty crazy. Going to NIPS last year in Barcelona, it was a complete zoo. There was thousands and thousands of people there, and I couldn't have even imagined, from this is the same stuff I used to work on in 2001 that no one cared about, and then you show up at NIPS and there's like 5,000, 6,000 people. It's crazy. So I think the academic community has already adjusted. If you look at everyone who's going into their PhD right now, who's maybe 20, 21 years old, they all want to do deep learning, right? And so the popularity of the field and the way that the academic community has reacted and adjusted is quite efficient. And so I think we're kind of missing a little bit this notion of the efficient market hypothesis. And so people have assumed that it's going to continue that way for a very, very long time, just because deep learning was unsexy and no one paid attention to it for a long time. It created this extraordinary shortage. And then there was a period of these, frankly, kind of wacky acquisitions, right? You had the DeepMind deal and other ones like this. And then of course, Twitter, who's always kind of, last to the dance, shows up with the Magic Pony deal for like $250 million for 10 guys from Cambridge or whatever, right? And you're like, I don't know about that one. Maybe you guys are a little late to the dance here. But I think that's, that was the sort of tailing off of for me, the Twitter Magic Pony deal was kind of the tail end of this absurd, extraordinary premium on deep learning. And then now, more and more, it's becoming just part of the machine learning toolkit.
To be clear, you're not saying that machine learning is going commoditized anytime
No,
soon. It's just specifically deep learning.
It's just specific, and to be clear, like by commodity, I just mean that the machine learning community will have these capabilities, whereas it was really quite a surprise. Like this recent kind of explosion where all of a sudden computer vision works pretty well, and we're using deep nets and NLP. This wasn't something that 10 years ago anyone thought was going to happen, right? So this was a surprise, and we had to react to it. So it's taken some time, but now it's kind of more stable. But in terms of machine learning being commodity more broadly, I don't think that's the case. So it's an important distinction, you're right. I think actually most companies will not be able to use machine learning. Even though deep learning may be commodity within the machine learning community is still way too small to be commodity overall.
Yeah, that's something that I see a lot, especially with TensorFlow, right? That they created this whole weird signal that suddenly machine learning was open source, available, and started seeing this whole flow of Harvard MBAs, saying, hey, I got a CTO that knows some TensorFlow,
right,
off to the races.
Yeah, totally. I saw there's one like super junior, like 22-year-old kind of like, junior principal venture guy last year told me, why can't one of my teams just duplicate this in TensorFlow in a weekend? And I'm like, you have no idea what you're doing, and that's a great signal of a top in AI. It's like, yeah.
And very much to this point, another one of your predictions is AI is clean tech 2.0 for VCs.
Yeah.
Including because of the self-important, save the world mentality.
Yeah. So you guys have, was anyone around for clean tech? Does anyone remember the clean tech bloodbath that happened? So it's a similar kind of a thing where you have to understand science. So we have to think, which a lot of investors aren't the best at. And then also, it lures you in, right? I think with clean tech or with AI, it lures people into this idea that they're going to personally save the world by writing a check, right? And it's not going to happen, of course. But for some reason or another, it gets everybody excited that they're part of some kind of huge movement, and they start to really go bananas about it. So I do think that a little bit of what I see with AI lately is fairly similar in the sense that, number one, you see people diving in without understanding, any modicum of the scientific competency that they would need to have to get into it, or trying to invest in it. But they'll just, befriend somebody that they think knows about AI because they worked at Google, and then ask them stuff. And then, that's like their version of kind of diving in, right? So I think insofar as that continues to happen, those people are going to lose a lot of money. Yeah.
Great. Great.
He's like, oh no, I hope I'm not one of them. You've been in the game a little longer, so you've done more diligence.
None of this was about me.
Yeah.
And so you have some super interesting thoughts, and I actually want to spend a bunch of the time we have to talk about market positioning, and if you're building an AI startup now, how do you think about what you should build and how you should position it? I guess the first part of this is that you were saying that machine learning as a service, it will die a second death.
Yes. So we at Data Collective have already invested in a couple of generations of these machine learning APIs. None of which, by the way, I championed the investment in. But, anything that worked was me. But, the thing is, here, it's pretty simple. If a team knows what they're doing, then they tend to use open source and cobble it together themselves. And if you do have an API that I could use with one of my teams, most likely with the types of problems that we're going to attack, we'll very quickly tap out the zone where the economics make any sense. So we might bootstrap off it for a little bit during like a POC phase with a customer or something. But as soon as I get to tag millions of documents, then your topic classifier API is now too expensive for me. And it's also very cheap to replace. It's relatively commodity tech, actually. So I'm gonna take 2 engineers on my machine learning group. I'm gonna put them on this for a month, and they're gonna come out and they're gonna have a topic classifier API that's as good as yours or pretty close, and it's gonna cost a tiny fraction. And those economics will continue playing out again and again and again. And so what it's created is basically a sort of a graveyard of these companies that think that they can do what Google or Amazon or Microsoft are now trying to do with this machine learning as a service stuff. And I would argue that those companies are also failing, right? IBM, Google, Amazon, Microsoft. Has any of them showed us any of their numbers on how the revenue numbers are looking from these machine learning as a service cloud APIs? They haven't. I don't think they're very good. I think the numbers are good for basic compute primitives like storage, compute cycles, but I do not think that these numbers are going to be good for these machine learning APIs. And I think those bigger companies are going to lose a massive amount of money over the next several years. And it's basically a bunch of people doing the Google Plus, right? They're looking at Amazon AWS and they're saying, shit, we missed it. Like, let's go after it with AI. Right? It's the same. It's like Google, you guys already did this with Google Plus once, right? We don't need to do it again. You don't need another 2,000 engineers on this project and burn another $200 million to realize that Bezos beat you to the punch 5 years ago. That's already clear. We can kill it now, right? But they're going to keep going. And I think it's kind of sad. But for the founders, right, we don't have to do this. Like, we know these aren't good businesses. So I think we see image tagging, text tagging, all these kind of if you're doing a low-level tagging API, I really, really worry about your defensibility and the ability to scale that business. I would really caution you to consider whether or not you might be better focused on solving a higher-level business problem than a lower-level task-oriented problem that will be turned commodity pretty quickly. So I'm really not into those kind of businesses.
Yeah, I get that impression.
Yeah, and then and there's another the flip side of the coin, right? So that's the sort of like the negative, not so exciting part about being very horizontal and being kind of like let's call it a mile wide and an inch deep. But there's a positive side too, which is that almost all of the really smart machine learning people are in less than 10 companies in the world. They're actually in less than 5, right? In fact, they're mostly all at Google and Facebook, right? So they're mostly all at 2, right? So in reality, you don't even have that many good ones that are outside of that at Amazon and Netflix and LinkedIn, et cetera. If you add all the other ones up, it's still smaller than the research group at Google or Facebook. So what's going on? There's this extraordinary centralization of talent within tech, right? And this is just within, think of how many tech companies there are and how hard it is for the tech companies outside of Google and Facebook to get good ML talent. Now imagine what it's like for people that are working on shale oil, right? Or palm oil, right? Or transportation networks. They have a hard time. And so in so many different industries, people from tech that have a background in machine learning can go out and make a massive impact on huge problems, many of which, if you search on Google Scholar, you'll find almost no work on. So there's academic contributions to be made, industry contributions to be made within these other fields. And we haven't even scratched the surface. So for me, it's kind of a no-brainer. Do you want to work on a NLP API for tagging documents so that you can sell it to other tech startup people working on the same stuff? It's like you're in the same sphere, you're stuck in the same sphere. Or is it a bigger opportunity to go out and apply your skills in pharma or transportation or clean energy or something else, right? And for me, it's kind of a no-brainer. When we look at the volume of the startups that we see that come to pitch us, and I look at the ideas that I work on or that my friends work on that have worked in applied AI for over 10 years, I mean, there's such a small number of really good ideas and teams that are thinking properly about ideas out in these other verticals as compared to the stuff that you see in the core tech kind of plumbing, that it's kind of very obvious that you should shift your energies. So
you were saying that if you're going to go that vertical route, you should go full stack as well and offer everything from the interface to the guts of
I think so, yeah. I also think another thing that people will underestimate a lot when it comes to machine learning is like the value of the full stack product and the degree to which the value of the machine learning comes from how it's integrated into the product, right? So if you look at what we do with Merlon with bank compliance, the majority of the thinking behind some of these core interaction paradigms is just basically stealing, from Google and Facebook and other people that have already figured all this stuff out in a different domain, right? And we're coming in and saying, well, if I'm an analyst sitting here looking at hits of potential bad actors against this individual who's signing up for a bank account, well, that looks a lot like a search problem or like a news feed ranking problem or something where, I have an entity and then I end up with some feed of content that I'm screening this entity against. And you end up with the same kind of classification and learning to rank problems that you have in consumer internet. But nobody's really applied that kind of tech in this area. So we're literally just taking the state-of-the-art ideas from consumer internet, lifting them up, and then dropping them down in this other domain. And I think, yeah, exactly. It's kind of the revenue version of transfer learning. Exactly, yeah. But I think what's pretty interesting about it is that, there is this need, I think, to help people understand how machine learning can solve their problems. And if you don't come to them with the solution, but you kind of come with a really great piece of technology that could solve the solution, you kind of drop the problem back in their lap, right? So you're like, here's something that comes, 80% of the way to your solution, and you guys can definitely figure out what to do with this, right? The answer is no, they definitely can't, because they're not used to dealing with this. So you got to kind of come all the way up to spoon feeding them the solution, or else I worry a lot about getting adoption for machine learning applications.
Great. Maybe one or two more from me, and then we'll give people a chance to ask questions. How do you think about the defensibility of those vertical startups? I think Omar in particular mentioned the concept of what I call data network effects here, but you were saying compounding effects. Is that how you used it?
Yeah, I think compounding effects is a terrific term. That's actually how I talk about it as well. I think what you want is this notion of kind of a flywheel between the data and the model. And this is another reason for the full stack application. If I can come in there in the Merlon example where you have no data from any of your army of analysts that are saying yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, this is risky, this is not risky all day long. If you're not capturing any of that analyst interaction data, then you have no feedback loop to turn the problem into a learning to rank problem. So first of all, I want to come in with an application. I want the analyst to use my application. I want to instrument that and get that data, because now I can turn it into a learning to rank problem. But secondly, if I can do that now at a number of different banks, and none of them had any of that data, and I can learn from the data in all the different banks maybe in a federated or distributed fashion, and kind of export the learned parameters outside the bank, so it's safer. Then I can now blend them together, and I can have a model that I've learned across the entire banking system. So now I have a data compounding effect. I also have a data network effect. And I think there's loads of these types of opportunities in enterprise software or in SaaS software where you get kind of the B2B scenario, right? Where you're using the same kind of notions, again, just kind of stealing the playbook from the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, but then going and applying it in B2B and thinking about how you're gathering that proprietary data set and learning models on top of it and getting this compound value over time, where your product, your data, and your models are kind of all vertically integrated. And the further you go along, the more customers you have, the more data you have, et cetera, the more entrenched you become, the harder it becomes for other people to replace you. I think that's a really great aspect that can drive a lot of defensibility for AI companies, yeah.
What's an ideal team for a vertical AI startup?
Great question. So one of the hardest parts, I think, about building a great AI startup is getting the balance of the team right. What we mostly see is polar teams, right? So the very, very technical team, it's like the seven top kids from Stanford, this year, but they have no business sense at all, and like no product person, no design. It's just like it's like a built for acquire type of a company. And then on the other extreme, you have some guy who came out of the trucking business, right? And he's got this idea for pay per mile insurance for trucking using machine learning. And the idea is actually really solid, but the dude has no idea what he's doing at all. He comes from the trucking business, right? So you have, on the one hand, these guys like, hey, I'm building a startup around my thesis. And you're like, that's cool, but that was your thesis. It's not a business. And then the other side, you have the guy who's like, don't you like have some AI people who can help me build this? And you're like, actually, no, I don't. It's pretty hard to hire those guys right now. Sorry, man. So, I think the thing that you see very little of is the very smart business founder, the very smart machine learning founder that kind of realize they need to work together, and that also realize that they need to get a product person and a designer and a subject matter expert and so on together. So I think the ideal early stage AI team, like with my incubator, what these teams look like when they get to around 10 people is 3 or so machine learners, 3 or so data engineers and distributed systems engineers, a couple of front-end engineers, a designer, a PM, and an engineering manager. And they usually will either have a subject matter expert on the team, or we'll have like a cabal of advisors that will work with them very actively. And then we'll have a customer as well who's working with them very actively.
And to put that in context, at Merlon, you have some pretty heavy hitter on the AML side, right?
Oh yeah, on Merlon, we're way past this point now. So we're over 40 people. Our COO is really top-rate AML guy. He was the former second in line at the OCC. He was the COO of Promontory, which was the leading boutique regulatory affairs consultancy in the world. It was acquired by IBM recently. Yeah, exactly. You've got to invest the time to go out and get the subject matter experts and round out the team. And that one of the hardest things can be this issue where you kind of massively overvalue what you're already good at, effectively, right? And you undervalue what you're not good at. The only other thing I would say, the nuance there is that building startups is itself an area of subject matter expertise. And one thing to be careful of with these vertical AI companies is you can overweight the subject matter expertise too, right, in the domain sense. And in fact, in year 1 to year 2, it's pretty arguable that the commercial subject matter sense from the startup world is actually the most valuable part, and that you can a little bit fake it till you make it on maybe like that first deal and that first product, but then you've got to kind of import it pretty quickly. But you should be careful because sometimes you import the thinking from these bigger, older domains, which actually kind of gets in the way of the startup, ethos and the speed to market and so on. So it's kind of a subtle balance in those first couple of years. Definitely you come into year 3, year 4, you got to have really strong subject matter experts, and one of them better be an executive level person in the company and so on. But year 1, year 2, I see a lot of successes, including stuff I'm doing, where you didn't have those folks around the table, but you kind of bootstrapped that competency off of advisors and other folks like that. Yeah.
Thanks. All right, do we have a question or two?
You guys are exhausted for the night.
That was a lot of content tonight. All right,
Yeah.
one. Yep.
You talked about feedback loops,
Uh-huh.
but you're also in a highly regulated environment. You mentioned very briefly that you have sort of exporting training parameters. How do you get around the feedbacks and say, well, how can I ship this feedback?
Good question. So so the question is, how do you deal with feedback loops in a domain like banking where it's very highly regulated and the data that you can feed back is actually controlled? So this has been a very long-standing issue in banking where they want to do data sharing for compliance because obviously, if I know about a criminal and I let him go sign up to your bank, it doesn't help me. I haven't out competed you in the field by doing that. So everybody kind of feels like it's a common good. The problem is what's happened to date is what I call the build it and they will come strategy of dealing with data sharing. It's like, let's put all the data into a pool and then we're going to do stuff with it. And that never really works. And so banks have tried to do that with these KYC pools. Like we're going to put all of our customer data into some pool and then magically something's going to happen. And it turns out that the magical thing never happens. And this has happened in every domain. This has been going on actually a long time, where people come up with this idea, the field of dreams idea, right? The data lake. and nothing ever happens, right? And so instead, what I think makes a lot of sense is the notion of obfuscation through parameterization, kind of, maybe you could call it. The idea that you might have some data which is PII, but I don't really want to see it anyways. If I get your PII data, that just brings me liability, right? Now I'm storing a bunch of your PII data on my servers or in Amazon or something. All I'm doing is creating risk for me to screw something up and for you to sue me, right? So in fact, I don't want that data. It's a liability. But the value, the learned parameters are the asset. So is there a way to somehow get that data outside the bank without taking the PII data outside? So I'm trying to push for Merlon. I'm trying to push in that direction pretty heavily. And for a lot of the other stuff that I do and companies I try to help, I'm trying to nudge them in that direction because I think it just gets around a lot of the problems. There's a lot of regulatory issues and liability issues and so on with some of this PII data, and you don't really want it. A lot of it is also very voluminous. I don't want to move that around all over the place. I'd rather find other ways to deal with it. So for me, I think that idea of a sort of federated learning system is quite interesting for B2B applications where there's sensitivity around sharing the data. Yeah.
Great. Well, it's been wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing all of this with us. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.